Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. So today's topic is training, and we're discussing resistance bands for strength and aesthetics. So how to use resistance bands for strength training and for kind of like bodybuilding, fitness, bikini, figure, wellness, classic physique, regular physique, all the damn categories that you all have. You can use resistance bands, and I'll explain what those are here in a second, for really any goal of training. You can use them for endurance training, you can use them in CrossFit, you can use them in strongman, you can use them in just general let me look better naked type training. So just having fun with them. So I do believe that they are an underutilized tool and something that are holding people back if they're not using it for strength and aesthetics. Whereas you can still get like awesome results with endurance and not maybe mix these in as much. However, there's an enormous amount of benefits, but I wouldn't say that an endurance athlete is totally missing out if they're not using bands. Typically, the reason why is because their need for strength in terms of like peaking out their natural abilities isn't as important. So they do need to be strong, but say a strength athlete who's doing like an Ironman, if they can squat 315, that's probably good enough. They don't need to devote more effort into their training and get all fancy with things and prioritize their resistance training over their endurance training to try to get their squat then up to 365. So their main goal is endurance. They have to make sure that that stays the main focus. So sometimes if you get too fancy with somebody where strength is important, but it's not the end outcome kind of their training, if that makes some sense. If you get too fancy in their strength training, you're actually just taking away from their ability to maximize what their true focus is. So I do understand that there's going to be a little bit of disagreement and or leeway for argument in that. But my point is, if I want to maximize every ounce of strength I have, potential to me, then bands are absolutely going to be a tool that I should be using. So it makes sense that for people who want to absolutely maximize every ounce of strength possible to them, which would mostly be strength athletes, and it does have very definitive carryover for bodybuilders, but that would obviously be less likely to be true in endurance athletes. They need to be strong enough. They don't need to have every ounce of strength, if that makes sense. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, resistance bands, what I'm talking about, are bands that commonly are mostly used in powerlifting, and they are 42 inches long, and they're a loop. And what you do is you typically are going to put them one end of the loop onto a barbell. You're going to take the other end of the loop and attach it to something near the floor, like it would be the bottom of a squat rack, for example, or you would attach it to the top of a squat rack. And then whenever you would try to do a movement, let's just say, for example, a squat, if I attach the band from the bottom of the squat rack up onto the bar, and then I try to squat, that band is pulling the bar down into the floor. And bands pull at a force greater than gravity. So it's actually going to be pulling the bar down through you, not having, like when we put plate weight on a barbell and we unrack it, the weight just sits on us. And it's being pushed onto us at the same rate we're being pushed into the ground, which is gravity. So it feels like it's actually just kind of setting on you. When you put bands on a bar and you unrack it, the bar is actually being pulled through you. So it's almost like somebody's pushing down harder than having the bar just sit on you. It's actually trying to be pulled through you. So band resistance is a very different feel than plate resistance. And that difference in the feel is one of the main reasons as why we would want to use these. So if I'm trying to fight and struggle against the strength of gravity, if I can put bands on a bar, fight and struggle against bands which are harder than gravity, and work at it and get good at that, then when I take the bands off and I go back to gravity, gravity almost feels easier. So this fits in all realms of training, is if I want to get good at something, I find something that's worse than that, but directly related, I get good at the worst thing, and then I go back to the regular thing, and all of a sudden it feels easy. So that's something we use commonly in all areas of training. So if I'm in aesthetics and I want to get bigger biceps, I have to train my biceps harder than they're used to get them to have a degree of change greater than I'm used to getting. So same thing with strength. If I want to get better at bench, I have to focus in some way harder on bench in order for it to come up. Now, typically too many people focus on more. So they would do more biceps or they would do more bench. When actually the better response is take the same volume you're already doing and just make it feel harder. So rather than I do more biceps, why don't I do bicep exercises that cause more damage? So I replace what I'm doing with stuff that's more damage resulting. And that way I can get bigger biceps, but not have to put in more and more and more time in the gym. So same thing, if I want to get a bigger bench, replace what I'm doing with things that are more aggressive. And what that point of that is there is a top limit to how much time you can spend in the gym, because the more and more time you spend in the gym, the less and less time you have to recover. So our job with training is to find what's the maximum quality of stimulus, not the maximum quantity. So if I'm doing ho-hum mediocre stuff, I don't want to do more ho-hum mediocre stuff. I want to do the best stuff. So you always have to be finding what's the best thing I can do, not what's the most I can do. And that's where bands come into play, is they can help us better our best. So they can help us do more advanced styles of stimulus, to where instead of me having to add more work, I can do the same work I'm doing now, just in a more advanced way and get better results from it. So there are, when you set up bands, again, like we said, is you can set them up, they attach to the barbell, and they're either going to be pulling the bar down into the floor, or they're actually going to be attached above the bar. And that is actually called reverse banding. So when you just band a bar, so if I do, say, banded squats, that implies that I'm pulling them like from the floor. So from the floor to the bar. That is the traditional way of doing bands. So it's not really called, banding from the floor. It's just called banding. I'm just going to do banded squats or banded bench or banded deadlift. And that implies that it's from the floor. Or I can do reverse banding. And reverse banding means I'm pulling from above the weight. And what this does is, as you would do the lift, as you would lower the weight, so if the band's attached above the bar and it's looped under the bar, as I would let the bar drop down, the bands would actually be taking some of the weight off of the bar. So it'll actually make the bottom of the lift easier than the top of the lift. Now, here's a little caveat, and this is going to be super fun to try to do with just words. That same thing is true when you band from the bottom. The bottom of the lift is still easier than the top of the lift. So think about it. If I unrack the bar to squat, I'm at the tallest place I'm going to be in the entire lift. So the bands are stretched the most, therefore they're pulling me into the ground the most. As I would squat down, the bands actually shorten, and therefore there's less pull from the bands. So it creates less weight feel of the lift. Then as I stand up, that band tension strength stretches, and again it gets very difficult towards the top of the lift, again trying to pull me into the floor. So both reverse banding and regular banding, they make the bottom part of the range of motion easiest, the top part of the range of motion the hardest. So why would we do one versus the other? That's what we're going to discuss a little bit here. And if I band from the bottom, that's different than if I band from the top, based on the amount of pull force provided by the bands. So he said the bands pull you down harder than gravity, but that's only if they're pulling you down. If the bands are attached above the bar, they're just lessening the weight at the bottom, but there is no pull beyond gravity. So you're still going to have the feel of just plate weight on the bar. You won't have anything above gravity. You're still just going to fight normal gravity. The benefit, though, is that it can allow you to use more plate weight than what you're used to using. So you still have the same stimulus of plate weight, but you get to be an overload in plate weight. Whereas when you band from the bottom, you will not be able to do the same amount of plate weight as you normally can because you have the added tension of the bands now. So instead of being overloaded in plate weight, you are overloaded in force being pulled into the ground. So it depends on what response I want from my body. Do I want to fight against force, or do I want to fight against plate weight? Now, this is why you would hire a trainer who knows all this stuff, because this can get very detailed, well beyond what I can explain in a podcast, about how to decide and define which one do I need for what type of weaknesses that I have in my training or aesthetics. So, increased plate weight, for example, can increase muscular damage. Whereas when you increase force tension, banding from the bottom, it doesn't really create as much muscular damage as much as it makes you have to output force harder. So it makes you lift with a stronger mindset of a mental contraction. So your mind to muscle connection has to be greater under bands when you're banding from the bottom. So you have to have a stronger mental contraction against the resistance. So instead of being able to just contract and coast through the lift, you have to continue to contract throughout the entire lift and really drive and force the contraction. So there's a lot of benefit to where if people are having trouble feeling certain muscles work. So in aesthetics-based training, if I have a hard time feeling my chest contract in a press, I can do banding from the bottom, and I can actually feel my chest contract harder when I'm banding from the bottom compared to plate weight. So if somebody has a hard time feeling their chest grow or chest contract, they can use bands from the bottom of the lift, and they will increase the ability to feel their chest muscles. This might not happen the very first set you ever do it. You might have to kind of practice it a little bit. But that's the benefit, one of the benefits. To whereas if I want to just get stronger in my ability to, say, support and brace against really heavy 1-rep maxes, I would reverse band. I would band from the top in strength training. So say a bench press. If every time I try for a 1-rep max, I kind of freak out a little bit, maybe I mess up my cues, I mess up my breathing, or I'm really shaky under the weight, I don't have a lot of structural support. I can reverse band the bench press and be able to unrack and practice unracking a truly heavy weight, like a 1-rep max weight. But when I lower the bar down to my chest, the bands will reduce some of the weight on the bar, and therefore I can still be able to press the weight back up. So I might have it to where when I unrack the bar, I have the feeling of a 1-rep max. But as I lower the bar to my chest, I'm at a weight that I could typically do for maybe 3 reps. So what this allows me to do is I know I can push something that I can normally do for 3 reps. I can push it off my chest for 1 rep. So I would get to unrack my 1-rep max type weight. I would lower it down to my chest. It's now at a weight that would kind of typically be a 3-rep max. So I can press back up to the top, have to restabilize, rebrace, retighten, and see if I stayed in good positions as I got back under that true 1-rep max weight at the top. I can then rack it, take a break, and I can do multiple singles like that. So maybe in a single workout, I can practice 4, 5, or 6 times unracking my 1-rep max, having to brace against it, and having to commit to starting a repetition with it. So that allows me to practice my stability and bracing under a 1-rep max, like I said, 4, 5, 6, even more times. Whereas if you were doing plate weight only, you might only be able to test your 1-rep max once or twice in a workout at most. So by using reverse banding, I can get 2 to 3 or even 4 times the degree of practice, the number of practices for that specific concept of stability bracing. So I can make much faster progress than somebody who does not use that technique. So that's a very specific way, but that shows you one of the benefits of bands for strength training is if you set it up correctly for whatever your certain weakness is, it can allow you to get more repetitions of a specific stimulus So you can make faster progress over time compared to somebody who doesn't use bands and has a limited number of instances that they can put themselves under that specific stimulus. So hopefully I haven't lost everybody here yet. So I do recognize that this topic is probably going to be pretty niche, and not everybody might be interested in this. I hope, though, if you actually did stumble upon this not knowing what it was, it might interest you. And if you are interested in bands, I'm hoping you're willing to kind of hold with me as I talk through all this very specific stuff. Now, if you do not have a good history of bands, I would definitely search on YouTube and learn more about banding. And then this podcast is even going to make even more sense. So, but let's first look at strength training because it's mostly common that bands are used in strength training. Then we'll look at bodybuilding. So in strength training, when you band from the bottom, that's the original purpose or reason why anybody ever used bands in strength training. When you band from the bottom, like we said, is whenever you're against the pressure of the band is pushing harder on you than gravity is. If you look at the dorky equation for strength, it's mass times acceleration, meaning how fast can I move heavy stuff? That's how strong I am. So not only how well can we move heavy stuff, so not just physical strength, can I lift something heavy, but how fast can you lift something? Speed of physical contraction, muscle contraction, equates into overall strength. Therefore, if you can improve your speed of contraction, you can improve your strength, in theory, and it's shown out to be true. But that's what banding from the bottom does. Is since you have to contract against a force greater than gravity, then when you take away the bands and you're only fighting gravity, you will now be able to contract at a force greater than usual. So you will have gotten faster against gravity by using something that was harder than gravity. So banding from the bottom is how you improve acceleration, which is one of the factors of overall strength development. So it doesn't mean that you have to move like a frickin' maniac and like throw things around with shit positioning and bad form. That's 100% the complete opposite of what these bands are intended to do. You have to maintain perfect, correct form and then contract fast. So if you look at Westside Barbell, they're by far going to be your best resource for information on bands. Okay, so search them on YouTube or go to their website, Westside Barbell. And Louis Simmons, the kind of creator and the man of Westside Barbell, he has enormous amounts of videos and DVDs and all that stuff and resources online. So you can look up dynamic bench press, okay, or dynamic effort. So whenever they use bands in their training, they would call it dynamic effort versus the days that they did more heavier style stuff that maybe sometimes still had band, but it wasn't speed focused. That's called max effort. Now, when they do max effort, they are trying to move as fast as they can, but they're also trying to move really freaking heavy weights. On their dynamic workouts, they're trying to move as fast as they can against moderate to light weights. So that way, just the moving as fast as you can is the maximum stimulus. So that way they can maximally focus on moving fast. Whereas on max effort days, whenever you include really freaking heavy weight, sometimes the weight becomes the issue more than the actual acceleration becomes the issue. So to learn more about dynamic or speed or acceleration style training with bands, you can look up dynamic effort from Westside Barbell. So the other thing that we have is that many lifts are limited in the ability for you to overload and kind of weight load that lift, meaning how much can you put forth, how much weight can you use on the lift, let's say that. So how much weight can I use on a lift is often determined by the weakest position of the lift. So for example, on a squat, most people are going to be weaker at the bottom half of the range of motion than they would at the top half of the range of motion. So what this means is for every squat they do, really only the bottom half of the range of motion are they putting maximal effort into it. Whereas the top half of the range of motion, maybe they only need 70 or 80% of their maximum effort. So this means that for every repetition, only half of the time are they under maximum stimulus. Whereas if you got to use bands and you reverse banded, so you put bands from the top, what that does is you would have to do practice and stuff, and there's ways to figure it out. But you would use an amount of band that allowed you to still maximally stimulate the bottom of the lift. But as you stood up and the bands lessened in their help, the weight would feel heavier and heavier and heavier as you got towards the top. So you would still be putting in 100% effort at the bottom, but as you got to the top half of the range of motion, now that the weight feels heavier, you might still have to put maximal effort into the top now. So, reverse banding helps you create a maximal stimulus throughout the entire range of motion. So, if athlete A did, say, 100 reps, well, let's just say 10 reps, that's more sense for strength training. So say they did 10 reps with no bands. They only spent 50% of those 10 reps in maximal effort. If somebody did 10 reps with bands, okay, athlete B maybe, they would then have been able to do all 10 reps with 100% time under tension of being maximal effort. So that's actually what we're looking to do, is by using bands, you can make every portion of the range of motion maximally difficult. And this lets you gain a stimulus response from every part of the range of motion. Now that stimulus response might be strength output, might be strength building, might be searching for muscle damage in an accessory lift. So stuff like that can change a little bit. But that's kind of the idea, is banding from the bottom builds acceleration, which is a factor of overall strength. Banding from the top allows you to maximally overload the entire range of motion for a maximum stimulus from every single rep of your training. So that's the idea of why you would use these things, is it can help you get faster, it can help you overload every single rep, all parts of the range of motion. So that's two really basic, and there's a lot more to this stuff, but I'm trying to simplify it as much as I can, is those are two simple uses of bands. So let's look at the specific lifts of squat, bench, and deadlift. So for squats, banding from the bottom, like we said, will help somebody work on acceleration. So as they go down, they have to make sure they control their position, because the band is actually pulling them down harder than gravity. So it makes them have to be more aware and more sensitive to their positioning. So if you're somebody who, as you go down on a squat, you tend to kind of come off your heels a little bit and load into your toes and load into your quads, and your bar path comes forward as you come down. Banding from the bottom will make that feel like absolute shit. You will want to die. So it'll actually force you to be more aware of, if you're drifting forward, you can stay pressurized more into your heels and feel that band pulling you straight down, which will compact you and actually make you feel better kind of muscular tension. You'll build better stretch reflex to come back up. So if you were to drift forward with bands on, they're going to exaggerate how miserable that feels. And you'll notice, holy crap, my lower back had to do a lot of work, or I really felt like I came up through my quads. I could feel my quads flexing really hard. So since it's pulling you down harder than gravity, you will be able to feel positional differences, more awareness at lighter kind of weight loads than compared to what you need against just gravity. So bands can help you be more aware of your positioning. That's one of the major benefits, okay? So most beginners suck at positioning even against plate weight. And most beginners are weak to the point where when you put bands on a lift on a beginner, they're typically going to be able to use less overall weight load than if they were to use just plates. That would sound like it's a good thing in the sense of kind of minimizing joint stress and muscular stress. But if they're a true beginner and they're actually weak, they need freaking joint stress and muscle stress to get stronger. So sometimes when beginners start using banding from the bottom for their squats, they're actually going to downgrade the physical development of that workout just to work on technique. Whereas if they were to get rid of the bands and just use heavy plate load, they can work on technique and on physical development. So if someone's on the weaker side and they have a low skill set, sometimes adding bands from the bottom is actually a detriment to their training. They're going to get less physical stimulus, and they're going to get an overload of technical stimulus that they didn't really need. Banding from the bottom works really well for super freaking strong athletes who want to squat maybe twice a week or squat really heavy every week. And if they were against plate weight alone, it would be too frequent of training depending on how strong they were. So if someone can squat 600 pounds, they might not want to do that every single week because it'll feel like shit. So they're going to feel like they're getting beat up. They're definitely not going to want to do that twice a week. So if someone's very strong, they can use a banded workout to still put maximal effort into that workout, but minimize the stimulus, the wear and tear on their joints. So whether you use bands from the bottom in the squat, really, in my opinion, depends on how strong you are. If you're weak, you want to avoid bands. If you're strong, you absolutely want to use bands because they'll help you protect your joints. Okay. Now, if banding from the top. So banding from the top, like we said, is a form of overload because it no longer is pulling you into the ground. It's just going to help you be able to handle heavier weights at the top of the squat. So again, we said typically at a squat, you are limited to what you can use at the top by what you're able to do at the bottom at parallel. So parallel is where most people are weak. Therefore, the only weight you can use in the squat is dictated by the only thing you can do at parallel. So towards the top half of the range of motion, even if you're stronger, it wouldn't matter because you can only use what you can use at parallel. If you use reverse banding from the top, that allows you to add more resistance to the top part of the range of motion, and therefore it makes more of the entire rep useful. So when you are weak, if you band from the top, you should do that incredibly more often, if not like almost all the time, because it's going to help you maximize your physical stimulus while still getting the technical benefit of a squat practice. So if I am weak and I can't lift very heavy things, then I'm going to be limited in how much stimulus and kind of muscle damage and certain nervous system damage I can create per workout. And therefore my physical development is going to be very slow. So if I reverse band, I can put more weight on myself and I can force myself to grow faster. If you're very strong and you reverse band it all the time, you would beat the living shit out of yourself because it's an overload in weight. And if you did that every week on end, and especially every twice a week, there's no way in hell you'd survive that. But if you reverse banded every single week for multiple weeks, you would eventually run into some joint pain, some physical pain, because your natural strength is so high, you're going to maximally stimulate and kind of damage the connective tissues, the muscle tissues, all of that already, even without the reverse band overloading. So again, if someone is weak, they would want to use bands from the top a whole bunch. If somebody's strong, they don't want to use it that often because they're probably already overloaded with their own strength of just plate weight. So summary of squats is if you are a weak lifter and you're trying to get up to where you can squat, let's say up to about 2 times your body weight. This is going to offend some people, but in general, I would say you're weak if you can only squat your body weight, and you're kind of intermediate, maybe like still kind of somewhere in the middle, if you can squat up to 2 times your body weight. So if your 1 rep max is 2 times your body weight or less, you would want to band from the bottom almost never and band from the top a lot. If you can squat over 2 times your body weight, you want to mix in bands from the bottom, but stay away from bands at the top. Okay. Now for bench press, we're actually going to run into pretty much the exact same problem. Is the lift, again, if you're weak, you're not going to be able to bench very much in your training. So if I'm a female, and I use reverse band benching all the time for females because it's absolutely wonderfully useful. So let's say male or female, because I don't want to pick on the ladies, but male or female, and if you can only bench your body weight, that, like for a 1 rep max, that means when you're doing repetitions in practice, you're lifting less than your body weight. That's not going to cause a lot of physical damage on your muscles and joints. It really won't. So if you band from the bottom we already said that increases the acceleration into the floor, but it'll decrease your overall weight load that you can perform. Well, if you already can't do a very significant weight load, why the hell would you band from the bottom and make it even less? So you're going to do reverse banding so you can help overload the weight load of the lift, still get tons of technique practice, but you're going to get an overload on your system. So this helps you build up your connective tissues, build up your muscles, and help you lift heavier than what you naturally could to force your body to progress faster in physical development. So if you can only bench press your body weight, and I would argue that maybe like up to 1.5 times your body weight for bench press, is you would not want to band from the bottom, you want to band from the top almost all the time, and find a bunch of variations of that. So don't band from the top and then always do 1 rep maxes. That's dumb. Your body's going to get too adapted to that. So practice with sets of 5, sets of 3, sets of singles. You can do competition pauses. You can do off the shirt pauses like Spoto presses, stuff like that. You can do positional pauses. You can do a whole bunch of variations of things. So slow to centrics, you can do isometrics. There's a whole bunch of craziness you can do to mix up the style of a bench press. So the execution differences. So you want to include a lot of execution differences, but make sure you band from the top almost all the time so that way it'll overload your system and help you grow faster. If you can bench over 1.5 times your body weight, you're going to want to bench from the bands from the bottom more often to help you work on acceleration